Could you describe yourself?
I'd say I'm a fairly social person. I'm empathetic and compassionate. I'm also pretty introspective as well. I like to think about big picture topics and morals and ethics and stuff related to that. So that's what I'd say.
Psychotropic presents Brock. What was it like growing up for you?
I had a pretty great upbringing. Pretty unremarkable in like the best way possible, I'd say. No real physical or emotional or like sexual trauma like I know some other people experience. I have a brother who's 3 years older than me and two parents who worked hard and loved me, and I was never really worried about food being on the table. I played organized sports and went to summer camps, so pretty quintessential childhood, I realized, compared to some other stories I've heard on the podcast and what other people go through. So yeah, I had a great group of friends through elementary school. Yeah, it was a good upbringing.
What did you find yourself doing, like as a child? What are some memorable things that you can recall?
I just spent a lot of time with friends. I played, a lot of Call of Duty. Played sports. I played a lot of soccer growing up, and I did some skiing and played hockey. Yeah, I mean, homework, and it was a pretty good upbringing, like a fair balance of love and bickering. I mean, I had lots of bickering with my parents and brother, as a lot of people do, but yeah, just stuff like that. Sports, video games, hanging out with friends.
Was substance use prevalent anywhere in all of this?
No, it definitely wasn't prevalent. I was super naive related to substances growing up, for sure. My parents drank sort of socially, but to this day, I've really never really seen either of them drunk. They would just have the odd like beer, a glass of wine. I realize it's just probably like luck and timing with your friend group, but I grew up with a friend group that didn't really dabble with any substances like through elementary school until grade 8. Yeah, we were just focused on like video games and sports and girls and stuff like that. Like, to show how naive I was, like our principal's name in elementary school was literally Mr. Cush, and we were completely oblivious to this. It wasn't until like grade 10 or 11 that his name just popped into my head one day, and I just laughed out loud, partially just because how like funny of a name it is, and also just for how naive I was all those years. Like I literally didn't make any connection. I probably didn't even know what weed was until like grade 8, when those like DARE programs came in and talked to you about how scary drugs were.
Before the DARE programs came in and kind of informed you about drugs, was there any notion of drugs besides, say, drinking as observed with your parents?
Not really, yeah, just drinking. My only memory of the DARE programs is just like a really scary before and after picture of someone addicted to meth, like 80 pounds lighter and scabs on their face. That's really all I remember from that program. I did have one exposure, kind of interesting exposure to substances when I was in grade 8. I was just playing video games one night. My dad came downstairs and said, "Hey, your mom's going to pick up your brother. Like, he was tobogganing and he's been drinking, so he's pretty drunk. So just like a heads up." And I kind of just laughed and kept playing. I kind of just thought to myself, okay, well, he'll just be silly or dancing or something. He would have been in grade 10 or 11, and I was in grade 8. But then when he got home, my parents called me upstairs and just asked to help bring him out of the car. So when I got to the car with my mom, he was essentially like unconscious, like blacked out, drunk, and like very limp, wasn't able to carry his own body weight. We like carried him in and just laid him on our on his bed, and my mom's a nurse, so she has some idea of how to wake up someone who's sort of in like a drunken stupor. So she was like, pinching his traps and doing the sternum rub, and he was just like super non-responsive. He was essentially just deep breathing. They weren't concerned he was going to die or anything. They realized he was just really drunk, but it wasn't really the expectation I had like an hour ago, an hour before he showed up. So I remember kind of crying and not really understanding what was going on. He went in an ambulance to the hospital. He was fine. He just had a lot to drink. He was a pretty like tall and slim guy, so I'm sure it just went to his head. But I don't really recall that as like a traumatic experience. It didn't even really bother me the next day or like 2 weeks later, but it probably subconsciously affected my view of substances and my view of alcohol, which might have put me off. That was really my only personal experience with drugs and alcohol up until the point of like grade 8, other than movies.
Yeah, I could imagine you see your brother, and from the picture you painted, it could look like he was injured in some way or incapacitated. And as a child, I could imagine that you were pretty active, like with the soccer and the hockey and the video games. That was probably the exact opposite of where you wanted to be. And especially if you had a good upbringing, it wasn't like you were trying to escape that or anything either.
Yeah, exactly. And part of it was also like my parents didn't enforce anything physically or anything, but they were pretty straightforward verbally about like breaking rules and drinking underage. I didn't have a fear, but I was definitely really aware growing up that I didn't want to get into trouble and didn't want to like cross those lines. If I ever did get in trouble in like a sports camp or at school, immediately the thought that would go into my head is like, oh God, like my parents are going to be pissed when they find out. And it was really just like their disappointment, I think. They wouldn't even really take that much stuff away from me. They might ground me a little bit, but it was really just like the idea of really disappointing them. And they were just quite conservative. So like drinking underage, like just wasn't a question. And whether I'd get in trouble for like acting out at school or like talking in church or something. So I definitely had like a healthy respect for authority. And I still do. I still find myself, if my friends are doing something that's, like quote unquote illegal or like trespassing and being really quickly, my mind immediately goes to that space of not wanting to get into trouble. Not in like a super anxious way, but just wanting to avoid that situation.
Do you remember your brother experiencing any repercussions from your parents for coming home or having to go get picked up in drunken stupor?
Not really. I think the hangover was enough of a punishment itself. My dad said the nurse in the hospital said she gave him like the slowest IV drip possible, so he'd feel like shit the next day. So yeah, I just remember him in the bathroom the whole next day over the toilet. So I think that was punishment enough. They probably had a talk with him that I wasn't aware of, but.
So, I mean, it doesn't really sound like drugs were demonized or anything. It wasn't like your parents were super harsh when it came to the limited substance use that was experienced. It just never came to you. It was just never a huge interest.
Yeah. I think a lot of it's just like timing. Like the class before me, like I'm sure people could have been using substances in grade 7 or 8. I think it was just sort of the luck of the draw. I got in with a pretty like naive and vanilla class, and we just, which I think is fine. I don't think having a naive upbringing is like a bad thing or anything. It was just, the way mine was.
What was your first memory of interacting with something other than alcohol? Maybe it wasn't yourself. Maybe you were watching somebody else do it, or somebody else had something.
Mm-hmm. Well, when in high school, probably grade 10 or 11, I went to a different high school than the high school most of my elementary school friends with, so we kind of separated. So I formed a new friend group in high school, and they smoked weed pretty consistently, like daily or several times per week. So it was really just starting to hang out with them. Like in the evenings, we'd hang out in like one of the guys' tree forts, and they would all smoke weed. And through all of grade 10 and most of grade 11, I would just hang out with them sober. I was just like that annoying sober kid sort of to them that didn't want to hit of the joint or didn't really want to drink with them. I'd sit in this tree fort in like November and it'd be cold and they'd be all smoking weed and giggling and I'd just be sitting there sober. And I was pretty content that way. I just didn't really have a desire to do it. I'm not sure why. But it sort of bothered them. Like they would almost like kind of chirp me and just call me like a pussy or something. I think it just kind of like irked them why I would just sit with them and not participate. Probably because they figured I had some reason against it and because they didn't feel that way that we were in some sort of disagreement. But yeah, I hung out with them. I might have had like a couple beers between grade 10 and 11. But yeah, I was exposed to weed like a lot through those 2 years.
You never expressed any disdain or distaste for it while they were smoking. Like you still hung out with them and everything, right?
Yeah.
But somehow they would still kind of flip you shit.
Yeah, pretty much just because I wasn't doing it. Like we'd hang out obviously sober, like at school lots, like have lunch. We had a bunch of classes together. And then a few times a week, we'd hang out in this one guy's basement or in the tree fort. And they would just smoke. And I don't really remember putting up much of a fuss about why I didn't want to. I just said I didn't really want to. I didn't feel ready, I guess, because I was so newly exposed to it. I remember like smelling it and seeing it for the first time. And I'm like, oh my God, like this is it. I just always heard of it. I just never really saw it. So, yeah. And probably the fact that it was illegal then, like it's not illegal in Canada anymore. It's a much more relaxed thought of it. But just the fact that it was probably illegal and like taboo and you were doing it in the basement or doing it outside at night. That probably put me off a little bit. And the idea of going home high in front of my parents was just not a pleasant option either.
You had the mind to be worried that you would be altered, like you would be visibly altered, and then your parents would find out and there would be that disappointment.
Probably, yeah. And there's probably some nights I came home smelling like it. I mean, I was sitting beside them. Sometimes they'd like blow it at me just as a joke because they probably knew I didn't like that. But yeah, it was probably that disappointment.
So you guys are sitting kind of up in a treehouse or someplace and they're smoking and everything. What would you guys do?
Just talk. I mean, they would just giggle and have, high thoughts and just laugh about stuff like that. We just have conversations really. Yeah, sit around and smoke. We didn't really go anywhere or do anything active with it. So
when did this change? Like, did you end up smoking with them or anything at some point?
Yeah, I did. It was probably partway through grade 11, so I would have been maybe 17. I think I knew I would eventually try it. I was just sort of waiting to feel ready, maybe just being exposed to it over time. And one night I sort of just decided to try it. It wasn't really, those small changes in your mind, whether you decide to do something or don't decide to do something. And, after hanging out with them for a year and a half or seeing them smoke weed so many times, eventually I just figured, why not?
How did you experience it?
It was in just like a pisser, we called it, like a water bottle that was jerry-rigged to be like a gravity bong, I guess, with, I don't know if it's a nut, but like kind of a bolt on top of it that you would pack the weed into. And yeah, you probably understand what I mean.
What did you call it again?
We called it a pisser.
A pisser?
Yeah, they called it a pisser. It was like those 500 milliliter cheap plastic water bottles. And I can't remember if they used gravity, like pulled a bottle out of the other bottle, but they would essentially put a small like nut or a cap, like I can't think of the word exactly, but and pack that with weed and then just put like some water in it. It was just like a cheap homemade shitty bong, basically, out of those like 500 milliliter water bottles.
What did you experience?
Well, I remember walking there that night and sort of having this internal conversation, like trying to relax myself, like, it'll be fine. I've been around them lots. Like they seem super mellow when they do it. Like it's no big deal. We were going to smoke at like an abandoned elementary school that was like 10-minute walk from my house, quite close. So yeah, I told them I was willing to try it tonight, and I was pretty nervous for sure. So they just packed me a bowl. I can't really remember whether it was big or small, but I took it and sort of coughed immediately, and walked around for like 10 seconds coughing, and I didn't really know what to expect. I expected you to feel high like as you exhaled it. So I came back to them like 15 seconds later, and I was like, I don't feel anything. And as good friends do, they're like, oh, we'll just take another one. So I did. I did a second one, and I've never blacked out from drinking or during my psychedelic experiences or even with cocaine or anything, but that was probably the closest to a blackout experience I've had, because I don't really remember the come up or anything. I just remember coming to, and I was down on one knee, mid-sentence, explaining to them how I was feeling. And they were sort of standing in like a semicircle around me. A few of them had like their phones out videotaping, like they were laughing because I was just so high. But I remember explaining it to them, like every 3 seconds it was sort of like a loop. Like I would be in first person vision and explaining, and I felt like my normal self. And then like 3 seconds later, I'd be like almost just above my body. And then like 2 seconds later, I'd be in first person. And I was trying to explain this to them. And they were just laughing, and they're like, man, you're just really high. Like, it's okay. But yeah, I was just unbelievably high. Out of all the substances I've probably ever done, that was the most intoxicated I've ever been.
Was that a pleasant experience for you, or were you kind of like, I'm done with that. I'm not playing with that again?
Yeah, no, it wasn't super pleasant. I can't place exactly what the feeling feels like now, but I remember that day quite well. I remember explaining it to them on one knee. I kind of distanced myself from them for like half an hour. I remember like lying under a tree at one point. It was like November and spitting rain. It was kind of a shitty night. And I ended up puking, actually. I remember puking like spaghetti all over the place, and they're all just like, oh, man. So that was a buzzkill. Yeah, it was a pretty shitty experience. And then I just walked home super high. I remember like walking or like jogging at one point for what felt like 30 seconds. And then I looked up and I was in the exact same place. Like my depth perception was really weird. It's as if I was, my sense of time and just depth perception was pretty weird. I remember that walk home feeling sort of like a dream, and also sort of feeling like forever. And I just went home and had a shower and passed out.
You never had to interact with your parents. You were able to get through them and just get up to your room and lock yourself up.
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, I got right in the shower and I was still super zoned out. And I remember hearing my name faintly, like, Brock. But I didn't respond to it. And I'm like, Brock again. And then I finally realized it was my dad, just like hollering into the bathroom. He's like, Brock, are you good, man? I don't remember why. I actually never asked him really why he said that. I wondered if he was just, I don't know if he would have smelt it and maybe wondered if I was high in there. Probably not, but he just asked if I was good. And I was like, oh yeah, I'm good, man. And then, yeah, I just showered and went to bed. I didn't really have to interact with him much, thankfully.
Dude, it sounds like you have really good parents.
Yeah, no, they're awesome. Yeah. Yeah, I love them a lot. They're very supportive. And I mean, other than being a bit conservative and distilling that like respect for authority, which is, I mean, probably a good thing. So yeah, they're awesome.
So you've basically talked about various episodes where your parents interacted with you, well, or your sibling, your brother, while you guys were intoxicated. In the first episode, your brother got really drunk and they basically had to go pick him up. And then they dealt with that in a specific way. In the second episode, you came home really high and basically beeline to the shower and then to bed. And while you didn't outright state it, in my head, I can't help but think that your father, he had an idea that something was up, that maybe you were stoned. You had mentioned that you suspected that you often came home, or you had come home smelling like weed on previous occasions, so they had to have some idea about what you were doing or who you were hanging out with. And so you end up in the shower in this specific instance, and he's knocking on the door asking you, like, hey, Brock, you all right? And yeah. Assuming that he had an idea about what was going on, you have these two instances where your parents dealt with these situations in a certain way. What do you think their philosophy about parenting was that enabled them to respond to these situations in the ways that they did?
Yeah, well, they were definitely conservative in the way that they didn't encourage us to really try substances or use them too much. Like, they were never going to purchase alcohol or tobacco for us underage. They definitely didn't encourage us or even really talk about using marijuana or ever trying cocaine, stuff like that. They were definitely opposed to that in that way, but I think they balanced that conservatism with a lot of showing love and caring so that it wasn't such a forbidden fruit. Like, I knew they were never going to really like blow up about it, or they weren't so over the top in discouraging us from trying substances. They would know we were going to a party underage and probably assume we were going to be drinking or smoking a little weed, but they would say stuff like, if you're ever in a sticky situation or you ever don't have a safe ride home, like, just call us and we'll come get you. So they were pretty open about deterring us from trying substances. Like, they weren't really supportive of them, but they also cared enough that they wanted us to feel comfortable going to them if we ever got in like a hairy situation with them, with substances. So I think that's how they kind of approached it. When they found out my brother had drank to so much excess, or maybe found out that I had smoked weed, like, they were definitely going to have a conversation with us afterwards. They were very communicative in that way, but they were never going to blow up and, throw furniture around and do stuff like that. So I can't speak for my brother, but I've always felt comfortable going to them in a situation where I need their help, but I know they'll be disappointed.
Do you think that that was a positive influence on your upbringing and your views on substance use, or do you think that it was a negative thing?
I think it was positive. I think it's such a fine line for parents to ride, that line of like discouraging your 12-year-old from trying like cocaine or marijuana, which is probably a reasonable thing to do, but also not doing it to the point that that child's never going to want to be honest with you because they think they're going to get in a lot of trouble, or if they get in a situation with substances that they can't like call upon you to support them. So I think it was positive. I think a lot of it has to do with luck too, like nature and nurture, like my brain chemistry and whether I ended up being addicted to something. I think that plays a role in it too. But yeah, I think it's a pretty fine line to ride. And I think they wrote it pretty well. I always had a healthy respect for substances and authority, but I also felt comfortable calling them at like 2 or 3 in the morning if I was going to be like really high somewhere or needed a ride. So I'd rather not do that, but if push came to shove, I would. So
what do you think would have happened if they hadn't acted in that way, if they hadn't been so receptive and just letting you know that, hey, we are a safe space. If something happens, just get a hold of us and we'll get you. If you need a safe ride home, get a hold of us. What would have happened if they hadn't acted that way?
Well, I think one of their fears was that, one of their children would get in a not so great situation with substances and then not feel safe enough to call them, so they would end up getting in a car with someone who is under the influence of something, or the situation would just become worse. Yeah, I don't think any child really appreciates their parents like blowing up at them, especially if, they had picked my brother up and like reamed him out in front of all his friends. Like, I don't think she did that. There was definitely a crucial conversation always coming. Like, if I had come home really high and done something stupid, like, I knew there would be a crucial conversation the next day or two, but they were really reasonable, like, in the moment, and probably realized that what someone under the influence of substances needs, like, in that moment, is more like love and support, and there's a time and a place for constructive criticism and like those crucial conversations. So yeah, I think like far on the end of the spectrum, being way too lax about things isn't always super positive, and then being super diligent or like over the top about punishing people is also not great. So they found a balance in the middle, and it worked out, I think.
This episode was produced by me, Philip Johnson. All songs used can be found in the description section of this episode. If you liked what you heard today and you want to hear more, please subscribe. Also, rate and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you're interested in getting sneak peeks of upcoming episodes, be sure to follow Psychotropic on Instagram at Psychotropic Podcast, all one word. Lastly, if you're interested in supporting the show by becoming a patron, or by grabbing a t-shirt, or if you'd like to write in, whether it's to share a story or tell me what you think, you could do all of this at psychotropicpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, everybody. See you next time.